Inside the galley, it's warm, the smell of coffee, the hum of steady engines, the routine of 34 men who believe they are safe behind 600 feet of steel. They have no reason to look at the floor and see a death warrant. But outside, the Atlantic is already searching for the cracks they were told didn't matter. By dawn, the warmth of that galley will be a memory, the steel will be a jagged wreck, and only 3 of these men will still be drawing breath. This is the forensic autopsy of the Marine Electric, a ship that didn't just sink, it surrendered. 24,000 tons of coal sit in the holds. That's the cargo. That's the weight pressing down on a hull built for a different war, in a different decade, under different rules. The men loading her in port that week called her old, but they didn't call her dangerous. Old ships carried coal up and down this coast for years. Nobody on the crew manifest thought this run would be different. But the forensic record tells a colder story than the crew's confidence did. The Marine Electric was a Frankenstein of the seas. Originally a World War II tanker, she had been cut open and stretched, a process called jumboizing. Engineers grafted a new midsection onto aging wartime steel. This meant 2 different hulls, born decades apart, were forced to move as one body through a violent ocean. It was a marriage of convenience that left a hidden fatal contradiction in the ship's very spine, one the crew was never told about. Nobody explained that to the 34 men walking her decks in February of 1983. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. Maintenance logs, the kind investigators would later comb through line by line, documented years of patchwork repairs. Rusted deck plating, corrosion nobody prioritized fixing because the ship kept floating, kept arriving, kept doing the job. That's the trap of a large steel vessel. She doesn't announce her wounds, she just carries them, quietly, until the day the math runs out. This technical history wasn't just a blueprint detail, it was a death sentence in slow motion. While the 34 men above deck planned their lives, the mismatched steel beneath their boots was already losing its fight against the sea. The math wasn't just about weight anymore, it was about how much time those men had left. The hatch covers that the detail investigators would return to again and again. Massive steel lids sealing the forward cargo holds, meant to keep the Atlantic exactly where it belongs, outside the hull. On the Marine Electric, those covers were known, not suspected. Known to be wasted by corrosion, poorly sealed, patched rather than replaced. And still, the ship sailed toward a winter storm, carrying waves the National Transportation Safety Board would later place near 40 feet, somewhere around 30 nautical miles east of Chincoteague, Virginia. Sit with that number for a second. 40-foot walls of moving water, striking a hull whose weakest points were already documented failures waiting for a trigger. The crew wasn't reckless, they were reassured. Ships this size, this heavy, this proven, don't buckle to weather. That was the operating assumption baked into decades of maritime routine. Bigger felt safer. 34 men went about ordinary shipboard tasks that night, checking gauges, standing watch, moving through corridors they'd walked 100 times before. None of that ordinariness registered as danger. Why would it? The ship had survived worse water. The ship always survived. Among those 34 men was Michael Price, an engineer who knew the guts of this ship better than most. To him, the Marine Electric wasn't just a vessel, it was a workplace, a second home. He, like 33 others, was operating on a trust that had been built over decades, a trust that the steel surrounding him was as solid as the routine he followed every night. But normalcy is not the same thing as safety. It's just the last thing you feel before the numbers turn against you. Here's the physics working quietly beneath their boots, invisible to anyone standing on deck. A ship displaces water to stay afloat. That's buoyancy, basic and reliable. But inside a compromised hull, differential pressure works the opposite direction. Water pressing against weakened plating doesn't care about the ship's total size or her decades of service. It cares about the integrity of the specific square foot of steel in front of it. And on the Marine Electric's forward hatch covers, that integrity had been eroding for years, wave after wave, storm after storm, inspection after inspection that failed to stop it. Understanding these failures is how we honor the truth behind the tragedy. If you value this level of forensic deep dive, consider subscribing to Forensic Protocol. It ensures these investigations continue to reach those who need to hear them. This is the part the forensic record makes brutally clear. The danger wasn't the storm alone. Plenty of ships survive 40-foot seas. The danger was a hull with 2 different berth years, patched instead of rebuilt, sailing directly into the exact conditions that expose a weak seal fastest, sustained pounding, relentless wave impact against corroded steel, hour after freezing hour, through the night. Every wave that struck those hatch covers was a test, and every test, the covers were failing it a little more than before. Invisibly, silently, below the waterline, out of sight of the 34 men trusting their lives to a vessel that had already made its decision. None of them could see the corrosion working. None of them could hear steel losing its fight beneath the crash of the storm. But somewhere, in the freezing dark, on the forward deck of a 605-foot ship carrying 24,000 tons of coal, the wasted steel finally reached its limit. The ocean didn't just find its way in, it found the 31 men who would never see another sunrise. The forensic clock had run out, and the fight for those 31 lives was about to begin in the freezing dark. Picture a scale you cannot see and cannot stop. Somewhere below the waterline, in the forward compartments of the Marine Electric, a few square feet of wasted steel are the entire boundary between a bulk carrier and the Atlantic Ocean. That boundary is now open. Water doesn't enter gently, it enters as force. Thousands of gallons per minute pour through the failed hatch covers into the forward holds, and the effect isn't simple flooding. It's a violent redistribution of weight the ship was never designed to carry. Naval architects have a term for what happens next: loss of reserve buoyancy. In plain terms, the ship stops being a ship and starts being a container, slowly filling with its own executioner. But here's the detail the forensic record treats as decisive, and it's the one most people never hear. The Marine Electric wasn't just flooding. She was flooding into 24,000 tons of granulated coal. Water and loose coal don't stay separate, they combine into a dense, shifting slurry, heavier and more unstable than either water or cargo alone. That slurry doesn't just add weight, it moves. It surges toward the lowest point of the hold with every roll of the ship, and each surge drags the bow down a little further, a little faster than an empty hold ever would. Therefore the flooding wasn't linear, it was compounding. Think about what that means for the men below deck in the dark. Michael Price, an engineer, was working in those lower spaces when the character of the ship began to change beneath him. Not sinking, listing, tilting forward first, then rolling, in a way that no one aboard had felt her do before in all her years at sea. On the bridge, on deck, in the crew quarters, 34 men felt the world tip. The bow began to bury itself, not slowly. The forward deck, the one the crew had walked across just hours earlier, doing nothing more dramatic than checking lines and hatches, disappeared beneath black water in a matter of minutes. Waves that had been breaking against the hull were now breaking over it. And now the physics turns cruel in a second, distinct way. As the bow drives down under the added mass of seawater and coal slurry, the stern does the opposite. It rises. The propeller and the exposed keel lift clear of the water, out of the waves entirely, into open, howling air. Picture the ship's silhouette at that moment. Not level, not listing gently, but bent into an unnatural angle no vessel her length was ever meant to hold. Bow drowning, stern reaching for the sky. This is the moment naval engineers call a hull girder under extreme torsional load. Every ship's hull is essentially one long steel beam, engineered to flex with intolerances across its length. But the Marine Electric was not one uniform beam. Remember the mismatched steel from her wartime hull and her later midsection. Different ages, different fatigue histories, different tolerances for stress, welded together and asked to behave as one structure. Under normal seas, that patchwork held. Under this angle, this load, this exact configuration of flooded bow and exposed stern, it did not. The stress concentrated exactly where the two eras of steel met, and then, no warning beyond what the crew had already felt in their bodies for the last several minutes, the hull reached its limit. The aging steel snapped the ship in half. Not a leak widening, not a slow structural giving way. A fracture, sudden and total, tearing through the midsection with a force loud enough to be described later as a detonation. Two halves of a 605-foot vessel, moments ago a single ship, now independent wrecks, both filling, both sinking, in the middle of a hurricane-force storm at night. There had been no time to launch the lifeboats properly. The break came too fast, the deck angle too severe, the storm too violent for the ordered evacuation the crew had likely rehearsed in drills that suddenly meant nothing. 34 men who minutes earlier were below decks, on watch, off duty, sleeping, working, were now in the open ocean, in the dark, in a storm, with no vessel left beneath them at all. The ship was gone. What happened to the men in the water next is where the forensic record turns from structural failure into something far harder to read. Water at 37 degrees Fahrenheit does not feel cold, not at first. It feels like a blow. The nerve endings register something closer to burning than freezing, a full-body shock that seizes the diaphragm and forces an involuntary gasp, dangerous in itself for a man already fighting to keep his head above a breaking wave. That was the entry point for every one of the 34 men now scattered across open water. No transition, no adjustment period, just immersion, instant and absolute, into a sea that was actively working to kill them. The body's response is not gradual, it is mechanical, and it is merciless. Blood vessels near the skin constrict first, a reflex meant to protect the core by sacrificing the limbs. Circulation retreats inward, and the arms and legs, the very things a man needs to swim, to grip a line, to pull himself onto wreckage, begin losing function within minutes. Not hours, minutes. The muscles, starved of warm blood, stop responding to command the way they should. Reaching becomes clumsy. Gripping becomes weak. This is cellular starvation, the slow shutdown of tissue that cannot get what it needs to keep working, and it does not ask permission. Survivors clung to whatever the wreck had left behind, an overturned lifeboat, riding low and useless in the swell. Loose debris, pitching with every wave. Some men held on to each other, which helped for a while, and then didn't, because holding on requires strength, and strength was the first thing the water took. Here is the detail the official record makes almost unbearable to sit with. Even the equipment built to save these men had already failed them by design. The life rafts required hands steady enough to pull an inflation cord, fingers dexterous enough to work a latch on a supply canister. By the time a man reached one, if he reached one at all, his hands were no longer his own to command. The cold had already taken the fine motor control that survival depended on. The tool meant to save him had become, functionally, unreachable, not broken, not missing, just impossible to operate with hands that could no longer close. Think about what that means. The last line of defense wasn't absent. It was right there, floating within reach for some of them. And it might as well have been locked behind glass. Time moved strangely for the men still conscious. Some later description of similar exposure events describes a creeping confusion, a fog settling over judgment right before the deepest cold sets in, men forgetting where the wreckage is, misjudging distances, losing the sense of up and down in water this rough, in dark this total. And then, somewhere out past the storm's leading edge, a light, a helicopter. Coast Guard markings, though no one in the water could have made that out clearly through the spray and the dark and the failing strength in their own eyes. It doesn't matter what they could see. It matters what it meant. Rescue. Close. Coming. The rotor wash cut through the wind. The engine noise grew, distinct even against the storm, building towards something that felt, for a handful of minutes, like the end of the ordeal. Read that carefully. A handful of minutes. Because the same storm that had broken a 605-foot steel hull in half was not finished working against wooden hope and human bodies either. The freezing spray, the violent gusts, conditions too severe even for a rescue aircraft built for exactly this kind of mission, pushed the helicopter back, away from the men, away from the wreckage field, retreating into the same storm that had put these 34 men in the water in the first place. The light shrank, then it was gone. There is no forensic language soft enough for what that moment did to the men still holding on. Hope, extended and then withdrawn, does something to the will to keep fighting that cold water alone cannot do on its own. Some of the survivors would later describe watching that light disappear as the moment something changed in the men around them. A stillness, a slowing, bodies simply ceasing to fight the waves, one by one, in the dark, in water that never stopped taking heat from bodies that had none left to give. The men who had been in the water longest began to go under, not dramatically, not with a struggle anyone could see in that blackness. Quietly, the waves simply closed back over where a man had been a moment before. By the time any rescue reached that patch of the Atlantic again, the math of who remained and who did not had already been decided by the water itself, hours before dawn. Dawn returns before rescue does. That is the first fact the record insists on. Not a triumphant arrival, a delayed one, the storm finally loosening its grip just enough for aircraft to work the wreckage field properly, hours after the first retreat had already done its damage in the dark. What the crews found in the grey light was not a rescue. It was a search. 3 men, pulled alive from water that had spent the entire night trying to stop their hearts. 3 out of 34 who had gone into the Atlantic together. The disparity is not a rounding error. It is the entire forensic argument in a single number. Proof that survival in that water was never about willpower. It was about arithmetic. Who went in earliest? Who lost core heat fastest? Who happened to find a piece of debris buoyant enough to keep a head above the waves a few minutes longer than the man beside him? 24 bodies were recovered in the days that followed. 7 more were never found at all, swallowed by a section of ocean that does not return what it takes on its own schedule. 31 men, confirmed lost. The Atlantic does not file a report. The National Transportation Safety Board did that instead, and what it wrote down is stranger and colder than most viewers expect. The investigation's probable cause finding was direct enough. Progressive flooding of the forward spaces, driven by deteriorated hatch covers and wasted deck plating, exactly the kind of corrosion this story opened with. That much, the forensic record supports without hesitation. But, and this is the detail that separates an official inquiry from a closed case, the board could not identify the precise structural event that started the failure. Not the exact plate, not the exact seam, not the specific moment differential pressure won the argument it had been having with rusted steel for years. The report used a particular phrase for it: undetermined structural damage. 2 words, doing an enormous amount of quiet work. An admission that the wreck itself, resting on the ocean floor, had disintegrated too completely to hand investigators the one piece of evidence that would have closed the loop entirely. The ship that killed 31 men could not, in the end, testify against itself. Sit with that for a second. A 605-foot vessel, gone in minutes, and the exact anatomy of its death lost along with it. That uncertainty did not stop the consequences from arriving. What the investigation could prove, the pattern of neglected inspection, the corrosion documented for years and left unaddressed, became the evidence base for a complete restructuring of how the Coast Guard inspected aging bulk carriers going forward. Enforcement tightened. Oversight of hull condition became less a formality and more an obligation with teeth. The 3 survivors, all of them young enough and fit enough to have marginally outlasted the cold longer than the men around them, became something the maritime industry had not had before the sinking. Living testimony to exactly what a hatch cover failure does to a crew with no warning and no time. The forensic conclusion, stripped down to its coldest form, reads like this: a vessel with known, documented, years-long structural wasting entered a storm it should never have been certified to face. Water entered through failure points the maintenance record had already flagged. The hull could not withstand the resulting stress. 31 men died in water that gave their bodies no chance once submersion began. And the exact initiating fracture, the single plate, the single seam, the first point of failure, was never recovered from the wreck to confirm it. That is where the official record ends. Not with resolution, with an open question the ocean floor still keeps. The ocean floor may keep the final fracture a secret, but the lessons of the marine electric are written in the lives of those who survived, and the memories of those who didn't. The evidence doesn't always speak, but when it does, it tells a story we cannot afford to ignore. The marine electric was a failure of steel, but sometimes the most claustrophobic tragedies happen in the places we feel safest. Click here to see our investigation into the Hamlet chicken plant fire, a case where a single locked door turned a workplace into a tomb entrapped for a box of chicken. Or explore our full forensic protocol playlist to see more cases where the math of survival ran out.